When Adolf Hitler came to power in January 1933, Germany was a nation defined by humiliation and instability. The Treaty of Versailles had stripped the country of territory, military strength, and dignity, leaving behind a wounded population seeking restoration. Hitler positioned himself as the man who would undo that defeat. His worldview, laid out in main camps, promised redemption through nationalism, racial purity, and expansion eastward, an idea he called Lebensraum, or living space. From the moment he became chancellor, Hitler's focus was twofold: consolidate absolute power at home and rebuild Germany's military might in defiance of international agreements. Within months, the Reichstag fire and the Enabling Act transformed a fragile democracy into a totalitarian state. Political opposition was crushed, trade unions were dissolved, and loyalty to Hitler became synonymous with loyalty to Germany itself. The Nazi Party quickly became not just a ruling body, but the embodiment of the state. Propaganda, orchestrated by Joseph Goebbels, painted Hitler as the savior of a reborn Germany. The population, battered by years of economic depression, embraced the apparent resurgence. Unemployment plummeted as rearmament and public works projects, most famously the Autobahn, revitalized the economy. Yet behind this progress lay a darker reality: a militarized, ideologically driven state preparing for war. The rearmament of the Wehrmacht, Luftwaffe, and Kriegsmarine violated Versailles outright. But Hitler calculated, correctly, that Britain and France would not intervene. The League of Nations, already weakened, proved powerless. Each gamble he took without consequence emboldened him further. In 1935, he formally announced the reintroduction of conscription, expanding the German army far beyond Versailles limits. The same year, the Nuremberg Laws institutionalized anti-Semitism, defining Jews as racial outsiders and stripping them of citizenship. This domestic policy of exclusion was part of the same ideology that would drive Hitler's foreign ambitions: a world reordered by racial hierarchy and conquest. The first major test of his foreign policy came in March 1936 with the remilitarization of the Rhineland. The move was a direct violation of both Versailles and the Locarno Pact, and Hitler's generals warned that the French army could easily crush the small German force if it intervened. But France, paralyzed by political division, did nothing. Hitler later admitted that had the French advanced, Germany would have withdrawn. Instead, he emerged triumphant, both to his people and to himself, convinced of his own infallibility. The years that followed saw Germany's expansion accelerate under a veneer of diplomacy. Hitler's speeches alternated between promises of peace and denunciations of unjust restrictions. The reality was clear: he was testing how far he could go without provoking war. Austria was next. In March 1938, German troops entered Vienna without resistance. The Anschluss, the annexation of Austria, fulfilled one of Hitler's long-standing goals: the unification of all Germans under one Reich. Again, the international response was muted. Britain and France, still haunted by the trauma of the Great War, clung to appeasement as the path to peace. Hitler saw only weakness. His appetite grew. Czechoslovakia, a democratic state carved from the ruins of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, became his next target. Using the ethnic German population of the Sudetenland as a pretext, Hitler demanded its annexation. The crisis culminated in the Munich Conference of September 1938, where British Prime Minister Neville Chamberlain, desperate to avert conflict, ceded the Sudetenland to Germany. Hitler assured the assembled leaders that this was his last territorial demand in Europe. It was a lie. The Munich Agreement, hailed in London and Paris as a triumph of peace, was in Berlin seen as proof that the Western powers lacked the will to fight. "Our enemies are worms," Hitler allegedly told his generals. By March 1939, he shattered even the pretense of diplomacy by occupying the remainder of Czechoslovakia, an act of open aggression with no ethnic justification. For the first time, Britain and France realized appeasement had failed. They issued guarantees to Poland, pledging to defend it against German attack. Still, Hitler pressed forward. In August 1939, he secured the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with the Soviet Union, a non-aggression treaty with a secret clause dividing Eastern Europe into spheres of influence. This cynical alliance removed the threat of a two-front war and cleared the path for invasion. On September 1st, 1939, Germany invaded Poland. Blitzkrieg, the Lightning War, combined tanks, aircraft, and rapid troop movements in a devastating display of modern warfare. Within weeks, Poland collapsed under the dual assault of Germany from the west and the Soviet Union from the east. Britain and France, bound by treaty, declared war on Germany. Yet for Hitler, the moment was one of vindication. He believed his destiny was unfolding exactly as foreseen. What began as an ideological crusade to reclaim German power had become a global conflict. He was confident, convinced that his will could bend nations to submission, just as it had bent Germany itself. What he did not yet understand was that the same hubris that brought him to this point would, within 6 years, destroy him and the empire he had built. The invasion of Poland was not only a test of military might, but also the first full expression of the war Hitler had envisioned for years. It was a campaign of annihilation cloaked as conquest, a rehearsal for a racial war of domination. The speed and success of the Blitzkrieg confirmed his belief that Germany's rearmed forces, guided by his will, were invincible. In the early months of the war, Hitler faced a curious lull in the West. Britain and France, though formally at war, did not yet act. This phony war, the Blitzkrieg, gave Germany time to consolidate its position. Poland was divided, its population subjected to brutal occupation policies. The SS and Gestapo moved swiftly to eliminate resistance and begin the racial restructuring of the region. For Hitler, Poland was not simply conquered territory. It was the first laboratory for his vision of an ethnically purified empire. Meanwhile, the Western Front remained eerily quiet. Hitler interpreted Allied inaction as further proof of weakness. He turned his attention to Scandinavia, where Norway and Denmark were vital to securing access to Swedish iron ore, critical for German industry and arms production. In April 1940, German forces invaded both nations. Denmark fell within hours, Norway within weeks. The operation demonstrated the precision of German planning and the reach of its new combined arms tactics. France, however, was the true prize. Ever since Versailles, Hitler had viewed France as Germany's primary continental enemy. The memory of 1918 haunted him. The humiliation of defeat, the punitive occupation of the Rhineland, the forced surrender of arms. Now, he sought revenge and domination. On May 10, 1940, the German army launched its offensive in the West. The Allies had anticipated a replay of World War I, a slow, grinding conflict along fortified lines. Instead, German armored divisions bypassed the heavily defended Maginot Line, driving through the Ardennes forest, a region the Allies had considered impassable. The maneuver was bold, risky, and devastatingly effective. Within days, the German army encircled Allied forces in Belgium and northern France. The British Expeditionary Force narrowly escaped annihilation at Dunkirk, evacuating across the Channel under relentless air attack. Paris fell on June 14th. On June 22, 1940, France surrendered. Hitler stood at the height of his power. In 6 weeks, he had accomplished what Germany had failed to do in 4 years during the previous war. Western Europe lay under Nazi control. France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Denmark, and Norway had fallen. Across the continent, fascist movements aligned themselves with Germany or submitted to its rule. Only Britain remained defiant. Hitler did not initially desire a long war with Britain. In his mind, Britain was a natural ally, an Aryan empire that, he believed, might yet accept Germany's dominance on the continent if its own colonial interests were left untouched. After France's fall, he offered peace terms, appealing to reason and self-interest. Britain, under Winston Churchill's leadership, rejected them. The Battle of Britain began in the summer of 1940. It was the first major campaign fought entirely in the air. The Luftwaffe sought to destroy the Royal Air Force and pave the way for a seaborne invasion, Operation Sea Lion. Early attacks on airfields and radar stations caused serious damage, but the RAF held firm. When German bombers began targeting London and other cities, the shift in strategy gave the British a crucial reprieve. By October 1940, it was clear that the invasion of Britain was impossible. The Luftwaffe had failed to achieve air superiority. Hitler, frustrated but undeterred, turned his gaze eastward once more. He believed that Britain resisted only because it hoped for Soviet or American support. Destroying the Soviet Union, he reasoned, would eliminate that hope and secure Germany's domination of Europe. Before he could act on that ambition, however, Hitler sought to secure his southern flank. Italy, under Benito Mussolini, had entered the war in June 1940 but performed poorly in North Africa and the Balkans. Mussolini's failed invasion of Greece in late 1940 forced Hitler to intervene. German troops swept through Yugoslavia and Greece in April 1941, completing the conquest in weeks. The Balkan campaign delayed his timetable for the invasion of the Soviet Union, but in Hitler's mind, it was a necessary prelude to the greater struggle to come. At the same time, relations with the Soviet Union, Germany's supposed partner under the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, grew increasingly tense. The partition of Poland and the Baltic states had gone as agreed, but ideological and strategic hostility simmered beneath the surface. To Hitler, Bolshevism was the mortal enemy of National Socialism, a racial and ideological foe that had to be destroyed. The decision to invade the Soviet Union was formalized under Directive No. 21, Operation Barbarossa, signed in December 1940. It would be the largest military operation in history, involving more than 3 million German troops and hundreds of thousands of Axis allies. Hitler's expectation was clear: the campaign would be swift. The Red Army, he believed, would collapse in a matter of months. "We have only to kick in the door," he told his generals, "and the whole rotten structure will come crashing down." Preparations for the invasion coincided with the expansion of Germany's global reach. In September 1940, Germany, Italy, and Japan signed the Tripartite Pact, forming the Axis powers. Though separated by geography and distinct ambitions, the three nations shared a belief in militarism and expansion. For Hitler, Japan's rising power in Asia served as both distraction and opportunity, a counterweight to American influence in the Pacific. By the spring of 1941, the European continent was under Nazi domination or control. Hitler ruled over an empire stretching from the Atlantic to the borders of the Soviet Union. The occupied territories were exploited ruthlessly, economies reorganized for German use, populations enslaved or exterminated. The persecution of Jews, already severe within Germany, expanded under occupation. Ghettos were established in Warsaw, Krakow, and other cities, foreshadowing the industrial genocide to come. From the outside, it appeared that Hitler's vision of a new European order was taking shape. The Wehrmacht seemed unstoppable, and the German people, buoyed by propaganda and victory, believed in their Führer's destiny. Yet beneath the triumph lay fatal assumptions: overconfidence, ideological blindness, and a contempt for his enemies that would soon prove disastrous. On June 22, 1941, Operation Barbarossa began. 3 massive army groups advanced across a 1,800-mile front. In the first weeks, German forces achieved staggering victories, encircling hundreds of thousands of Soviet troops. Kiev, Smolensk, and Minsk fell. The Red Army appeared broken. Hitler announced that the campaign was all but won. But as the summer wore on, the vastness of the Soviet Union and the resilience of its people began to tell. Logistics faltered. Supply lines stretched thin across thousands of kilometers. The weather turned against the invaders. Autumn rains turned roads to mud. Winter brought freezing temperatures for which the German army was unprepared. The drive toward Moscow stalled in December 1941. For the first time, the Wehrmacht failed to achieve its objective. The Soviet counteroffensive pushed the Germans back, and for the first time, Hitler's aura of infallibility was shaken. He blamed his generals, interfering directly in military strategy, refusing to authorize retreats even when survival demanded them. Then, in the same month, came a development that would transform the war entirely. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. 4 days later, Hitler declared war on the United States. He had not been obliged to do so under the Tripartite Pact. It was a decision born of ideological conviction and miscalculation. He believed that America, distracted by Japan, would be incapable of fighting a transatlantic war. In reality, he had just added the world's largest industrial power to his list of enemies. The year 1941 ended with Germany engaged on multiple fronts, bogged down in the east, locked in aerial combat with Britain, and now facing the prospect of an American-led coalition. Yet Hitler's faith in his mission remained absolute. He believed that sheer will and racial superiority would triumph over material odds. The illusion of invincibility had carried him through triumph. It would now lead him, and Germany, into catastrophe. When German forces surged across the Soviet frontier in June 1941, Hitler believed he was fulfilling both a strategic and ideological destiny. For years he had portrayed the struggle against Bolshevism as a holy war, a clash between German civilization and what he saw as the racial and political corruption of the East. The invasion was not simply a campaign of conquest. It was conceived as a crusade of annihilation. The early months seemed to confirm his conviction that fate favored Germany. Vast Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Entire regions were overrun in weeks. By autumn, millions of prisoners had been taken, and the Wehrmacht stood deep inside Soviet territory. Propaganda trumpeted victory after victory. In Berlin, Hitler's popularity soared to new heights. Yet even amid these triumphs, signs of hubris appeared. The German advance was breathtakingly fast, but it had outrun its supply lines. Fuel shortages, mechanical failures, and the sheer distance across the Soviet plains began to slow the momentum. The summer offensive, originally envisioned as a quick, decisive blow, turned into a grinding struggle against both the enemy and the environment. As the Wehrmacht pushed toward Moscow, internal divisions within Hitler's high command deepened. His generals urged caution, arguing that the front was overextended. Hitler, increasingly distrustful of professional officers, dismissed their concerns. "The Russian is finished," he declared. "He will not get up again." His interference in operational decisions, often driven by ideology rather than strategy, eroded the army's flexibility. By October 1941, German troops were within sight of Moscow. But the weather turned. Torrential rains transformed roads into rivers of mud. Temperatures plunged below freezing. The Wehrmacht, ill-equipped for winter warfare, ground to a halt. The Red Army, under Georgy Zhukov, launched a massive counteroffensive in early December, driving the Germans back from the capital. For the first time since the war began, Hitler's armies had been stopped. The illusion of invincibility was shattered. Rather than allowing a tactical withdrawal, Hitler ordered his troops to hold their positions at all costs. "Not one step back," he commanded, a decision that led to catastrophic losses but also, paradoxically, stabilized the front in the short term. The failure before Moscow marked a turning point in Hitler's relationship with his generals. Blaming them for cowardice and defeatism, he dismissed several senior officers and assumed direct command of the army himself. From then on, he would dictate strategy personally, often from his headquarters deep in East Prussia, poring over maps and issuing detailed orders to divisions hundreds of miles away. As the Eastern Front consumed vast resources and manpower, Hitler's empire began to strain under the weight of total war. In the occupied territories, Nazi rule hardened into systematic terror. Millions of Soviet prisoners of war were left to die in camps. The invasion had unleashed the next phase of the regime's genocidal policy, the so-called final solution. In 1942, the Wannsee Conference formalized the plan to exterminate the Jews of Europe. This policy was not peripheral to the war effort. It was central to Hitler's vision. He viewed the extermination of Jews as a prerequisite for victory, a way to cleanse what he saw as the racial and moral weakness of Europe. Even as the tide of war turned against him, resources were diverted to build death camps, operate railways, and carry out mass murder. Ideology, not pragmatism, governed the German war machine. Meanwhile, Germany's alliance system was fraying. Italy's failures in North Africa forced German intervention. In early 1942, General Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps achieved remarkable successes, driving British forces deep into Egypt. Yet these victories masked a strategic dead end. The Mediterranean campaign drained attention from the decisive struggle in the East, and the logistical limitations of the Axis made sustained success impossible. Hitler, however, remained fixated on symbolic victories. Convinced that capturing the oil fields of the Caucasus would cripple the Soviet Union, He launched Case Blue in the summer of 1942. Army Group South swept across the steppes toward Stalingrad, the city that bore Stalin's name. It was supposed to be another swift campaign, a demonstration of German resolve. Instead, Stalingrad became the graveyard of Hitler's ambitions. The guns finally fell silent in May 1945. Europe lay in ruins. More than 70 million people were dead worldwide. Entire cities had been obliterated, borders redrawn, and societies fractured beyond recognition. At the center of this devastation stood the wreckage of Adolf Hitler's Reich, a regime that had promised national renewal but delivered only destruction. In the aftermath, the world confronted a moral and political reckoning unlike any in modern history. The crimes committed under Hitler's rule were vast in scale and unprecedented in intent. 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, alongside millions of others: Romani people, Soviet prisoners of war, the disabled, and countless civilians. The industrialization of death at Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Sobibor revealed the full expression of the ideology that had driven the war from its beginning. For Hitler, racial conquest and extermination had never been separate aims. They were intertwined pillars of his worldview. His belief in a cosmic struggle between Aryan and Jew, civilization and Bolshevik chaos, shaped every decision he made. The invasion of the Soviet Union, the genocide of Europe's Jews, the enslavement of Slavic peoples, all stemmed from the same delusional conviction that history obeyed racial laws and that he was chosen to enforce them. When the Third Reich collapsed, it exposed the fragility of that vision. Far from ushering in a new order, Hitler's war shattered the foundations of European civilization. Germany itself was divided and occupied. Millions of its citizens were displaced, imprisoned, or killed. The Allied powers imposed denazification programs to purge Nazi influence from public life, while war crimes tribunals sought to hold leaders accountable. The Nuremberg trials, beginning in late 1945, established the legal precedent that individuals, even heads of state, could be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. Yet the shadow of Hitler's rule extended far beyond Germany. The Holocaust forced the world to confront the extremes of ideology, obedience, and modern bureaucracy. Ordinary people had participated in extraordinary evil, often without question. Philosophers and historians debated how such a catastrophe could arise in the heart of a cultured, modern nation. The answers were complex. Nationalism unrestrained by morality, technology harnessed to destruction, and a leader whose charisma masked madness. The war also reshaped global politics. The alliance that had defeated Hitler soon dissolved into the Cold War, a new confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Ironically, the Nazi invasion of the USSR helped elevate that country into a superpower, while the United States emerged as the other pillar of a new bipolar world. Germany, the power that had sought domination of Europe, was divided between them: East and West, communism and democracy. For survivors, the reckoning was personal as well as political. The displaced wandered across a shattered continent. Camps once used for extermination were now filled with refugees seeking home and identity. Memory itself became a battleground. How to comprehend the incomprehensible, how to speak for the dead, how to ensure that such crimes could never happen again. In Germany, the process of coming to terms with the past, Vergangenheitsbewältigung, would take generations. The first post-war years were marked by denial and silence. Many Germans saw themselves as victims rather than perpetrators, focused on their own suffering from bombings and occupation. But as evidence of the Holocaust spread, a deeper understanding took root. By the 1960s and 70s, a new generation confronted the moral bankruptcy of the Nazi period openly, demanding remembrance and accountability. From the broader perspective of history, Hitler's legacy is one of warning. His rise to power demonstrated how economic crisis, social unrest, and political resentment can erode democratic institutions. He exploited fear, grievance, and nationalism to transform a republic into a dictatorship. His regime showed how propaganda and lies, repeated and normalized, can enslave a population to ideology. The lessons drawn from that period continue to shape the modern world. The creation of the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and the European Union all emerged, in part, as responses to the devastation wrought by Hitler's war. The principle of collective security, that aggression anywhere threatens peace everywhere, was born from the failure to stop him in the 1930s, that yet the temptation of authoritarianism, the lure of simple answers to complex problems, remains. History remembers Hitler not only as a singular villain, but as a symbol of what humanity is capable of when hatred is given power and conscience is silenced. His downfall wasn't inevitable. It was the product of resistance by soldiers, civilians, and entire nations who refused to surrender to tyranny. In the ruins of Berlin, amid the rubble of the Reich Chancellery, the world could see the culmination of a philosophy that exalted strength over morality, race over humanity, and power over truth. That vision had consumed itself. The 1,000-year Reich had lasted barely 12 years. Still, the echoes of his rule endured, in the displaced millions, in the scars left on Europe's cities, and in the collective memory of the 20th century. The moral abyss of Nazism became the measure by which future generations would define evil. For historians, the challenge has been to understand how a man of limited intellect but boundless fanaticism could so completely dominate one of the most advanced societies in the world. The answer lies not in Hitler's genius, but in his ability to mirror and magnify the fears and desires of others. He offered identity to the humiliated, purpose to the aimless, and revenge to the resentful. In doing so, he destroyed them. His death in the bunker marked not just the end of a war, but the end of an illusion. That violence could redeem a nation, that hatred could forge unity, that destiny could be written by will alone. The ruins of Europe were his true monument. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt from the ashes. It embraced democracy, rejected militarism, and became a cornerstone of a peaceful Europe. But the memory of what had been, of how easily civilization can collapse into barbarism, remained. The story of Hitler's war, viewed through his own ambitions, ends where it began, in the failure of a man to see the humanity of others, and in the destruction that blindness brought upon the world. His vision of empire turned to dust. His final victory became his final defeat. What survived were not his dreams of domination, but the lessons of their ruin. Lessons written in the graves of millions, and in the solemn vow that followed: never again.